and welcome to Incorruptible Mass. On this podcast, we are here to help us all transform state politics. We know that we could together have state policy reflect the needs of the vast majority of the residents of our beautiful state. And today we are going to be talking about transparency broadly, but we'll have an incredible guest, Andrew Quemere, who will be talking about the Mass Dump newsletter and the Lights Out Mass podcast, where they delve into a lot of the issues we talk about as well, which is why our state government is exempt from public records law. We'll be talking a little bit about the commission that they created on their exemption from public records law, which is quite amusing. We will talk a little bit about sort of the ongoing lawsuits around this issue that are going on, as well as also some of the platforms and tools that we're all using here as podcasters, newsletter putter-outers, and all that. But before we get to our amazing guest, let me introduce my two fantabulous co-hosts. I will start with Jonathan.
Sorry, just unmuting myself. Jonathan Cohn, he, him, his, joining from Boston, and have been active on different issue and electoral campaigns in Massachusetts for like about a decade now. It's wild.
Wonderful. And Jordan.
Jordan Burke Powers, he, him. I'm coming from Worcester, Massachusetts, and I have. It is weird to live in a state where it's so hard to find basic information about our own government.
And I am Anna Callahan, she, her, coming at you from Medford. Love politics, local, deeply important to me, state politics. Wow, so mind-blowing here in Massachusetts, and love being on this podcast with you guys every week, and with all you listeners. And now, the moment you have all been waiting for, I would love to introduce Andrew Quemere. And if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, and then introduce your newsletter and podcast and what the purpose of those is.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. And so I write the Mass Dump newsletter. I am very focused on public records, which is probably one of the most important pieces of transparency. Public records law is basically a way to not just take people at their word in government, but to find out what's actually going on. It allows you to request records, which could be emails or written documents. It could also be videos, photographs, audio recordings. Pretty much any form of documentation could be a record. This is basically how I do a lot of the investigative journalism I do. I'm primarily focused on police and the justice system, but I'm also just very interested in the public records law itself and sort of transparency in government as a value, separate from any particular issue. Just as I guess what I would say is, like, transparency is important because you can't affect government if you don't actually know what's going on. Like if people are meeting behind closed doors and making decisions and we don't know who they are, what their motives are, what's going on, then you can't really have any say. And I just think that, having strong public records law is very important for that. But unfortunately, there are a lot of problems with the public records law in Massachusetts, which I write about all the time. And I think the topic we wanted to get into first is just to give myself a little shout out. We did a whole podcast about this that was released last week on my Lights Out Mass podcast that I host with Jeff Raymond. We did a whole episode about the governor, Maura Healey, and her approach to public records.
Yeah, we are going to get right into that. Before we do, I am just going to go ahead. I know we have talked about transparency and all of this on our podcast before, but I'm just going to give each of us a moment to chime in and just give our statement as to why it matters. I'm going to say mine, which is the ancient Greeks knew that you can only have democracy with an informed public. Like, that is basic. Like, if public is not informed about what the heck is happening, democracy breaks down. So anybody who's concerned about the breakdown of our democracy should be deeply, deeply concerned about the complete lack of transparency that we have in the Massachusetts state government. That's mine. Jordan, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say really quickly, it's when I say it's bewildering how the state is that, this is a state that thinks of itself as a leader in democracy. And in a lot of ways, as we've highlighted on this podcast, we are not. We are far behind where we should be. And the one that is so glaring is how much contempt they have for us to know and be a part of the process of them legislating. So really, for me, it's like, when you say that things should just be behind closed doors and you should just trust us and all these things, you're basically saying that us, the public, the people who are supposed to have oversight or democratic oversight over the things you're doing, can't be trusted, shouldn't be a part of the process. And if if doing so would somehow hurt the process, then what you're doing is hurting us. So I think I think the other pieces too, it's the pieces that are most, I think the other reason it's really important is that the places that are most opposed to public records are often the places that do the worst things to the public, right? Like they are the places, those are in fact the places that need the most oversight. So when you see a government who's willing to share what they're doing, that's probably because they're not worried about sharing what they're doing, and they're fine. They're like, yeah, have at it. We're doing great. We're here in terms of the public. And again, you see with the police, with our state legislature, with other government agencies that push back, that try to put roadblocks up, that put fines in place to try to get the basics of what are you doing, who are you talking to, what are you saying to each other. Often it's for a reason that they're putting up those roadblocks.
Jonathan.
This reminds me of, I was talking to somebody the other day, how I kind of view there to be a certain kind of typology of political lying. That you have the one type of political lying that we kind of know as spin, where it's bending the truth as far as you can bend the truth while still giving yourself the ability to say that you're not outright lying, because you've maintained the thinnest of tether. There's a political lying that comes from an imbalance of information, that you might think that a politician is lying, and they are, but you can't prove it, because they have access to information that they can represent how they choose to, and you don't have access to that. And there's the political lying that is like lying in direct contradiction to basically easily accessible information. The last category is something I often use when talking about Donald Trump, who there's direct, easily accessible information. You are lying, you're counteracting that. But that second category, and also to some extent the first, are where public records play a really important role. Because you don't have the ability to assess the veracity of many statements that politicians make, particularly if you have an imbalance of information. That if they speak about statistics, if they speak about things that they've been doing, you as just a regular person don't have access to the information, and you don't know if they're representing the information that they have properly, or if they're, let's say, just making stuff up, or just heavily massaging the information for to make their point. And so having the ability to get that information is critical. It's also, I think that I often think of the value of public records, public records and government transparency. Whenever you read a story, if you ever get the question of, I bet there's more behind this, because there are only so many words in any news article that you'll read, and then you can immediately start thinking, there are probably conversations behind this that aren't falling within the parameter of this story. Or I have so many questions about what's going on here that aren't being answered. That's where having the ability to discover what actually is behind the story is so critical.
Yeah. Andrew, talk to us about the governor's office. I think so all the people listening to this podcast, we're pretty excited to get a Republican governor out, get a Democratic governor in. Tell us what's going on.
Well, so I guess just real quick for background, there are exemptions to the public records law. So there's things like privacy. There's something called the deliberative process exemption, which is when there are policy making discussions that are ongoing. Certain records, you keep from the public until the discussion's over. There's a similar thing for law enforcement investigations. There's all sorts of exemptions. But for the governor's office, and also for the legislature and the courts, there's a total complete exemption. So technically, if you send them a public records request, they could literally just ignore it, and there's nothing you could do. They don't even have to send you a courtesy letter saying, hey, we're not even responsible for this. They could just completely ignore you if they wanted to. And that is something that is actually unique about Massachusetts. Massachusetts is one of only 2 states, along with Michigan, according to reporting from the Boston Globe, that the governor's office specifically is exempt. So that, puts us as an outlier right there. But then on top of it, Massachusetts is the only state in the entire country where all 3 of the branches of state government, the governor, legislature, and the courts, are totally exempt from the public records law. And
if I can jump in quick,
go
it's
ahead.
fairly common that the legislature is exempt, and there's plenty of reasons why, right? We're talking about the court system. It's the legislature that is unusual.
Yeah, but so this is a huge problem because, as we've been talking about, like, public records are important. You want to know not just, well, I mean, I guess if we want to talk about the legislature, we don't even know how a lot of the votes are. I think that might be something we come back to. But
Insane.
for the governor specifically, I mean, this is the most powerful single person in state government. They can, like, line item veto stuff in the state budget. They can do this or that. They have, the ability to declare emergencies and do all these executive things, unilaterally. They have tremendous power, tremendous influence in terms of the agenda for state government. And, it just doesn't make sense that, say, the mayor of Boston or the mayor of Framingham, a much smaller city where I live, is responsible for responding to these public records requests, but then someone who has even more power and is in control of things that affect the entire state doesn't have to follow that same standard that we expect of not just cities, but towns with like a couple hundred people might have to follow this law. But so why wouldn't the governor have to follow it? It just doesn't make sense. And the only explanation is just that people in state government don't want, sunlight on what they're doing. And whether those are always nefarious, or not, it doesn't really matter. It's just what matters is the principle of the thing, which is that in a democratic society, it's supposed to be an open society, and, government should take place to the maximum extent, possible out in the open. And people should have the ability to see what's going on and to affect policy. So I just think that that's wrong. And just to jump back to something Jonathan was saying, like, when you read the news all the time, you're like, hey, I have a question about this story. It leaves something out. And one way you can answer those questions, I mean, this is literally a strategy I have for figuring out what kind of records request to send, is I'll read something in the news and I'll be like, well, hold on, there's a gap in this story. I think I'll send in a records request to try to see if I can turn up some of that information. But you just don't have the ability to do that with the governor's office. So what this goes back to is a 1997 case called Lambert, where this attorney sued the governor's office, the Weld administration at the time, and said that she wanted this questionnaire that I think a judge, or I don't remember if it was someone who had been confirmed or not, but someone who was an applicant to be a judge had filled out. She wanted to see how this person answered these questions, and the governor's office denied her. And then the Supreme Judicial Court said that the governor's office is not explicitly included in the public records law, and therefore the governor is totally exempt. And so, this is about 25 years ago, this case came down. And since then, you've had Democrats and Republicans alike both claiming this Lambert exemption to the public records law. And, we had an interesting time during the election, because Maura Healey, well, actually, not just her, but I think almost all, if not all, of the candidates for governor were asked this question, basically, do you support changing it? And Maura Healey was, said that she supported changing it. And she also
to make the governor's office,
yes, to make
under
the governor's
public
office,
records law.
Right. And on top of it, about 2 weeks before, this is after she's elected, so she doesn't have to put on a front anymore, but about two weeks before she was inaugurated, she said, she was asked by Jim Browdy, the host of the GBH program, Boston Public Radio, basically, will you voluntarily agree to not claim that you're completely exempt from the public records law? So will you follow the law as though you were, the mayor of Boston or the mayor of Framingham? Will you only claim like limited exemptions like privacy, etc., and not claim this total exemption? And she literally just said to this question, yes. So in Jim Browdy, you can listen to the clip. He was just like, okay, well, that takes care of that. And she didn't elaborate on it. But then January, first month in office, she puts out this policy and like, it's right online and it just completely contradicts what she said. It says the governor's office is exempt under Lambert. And it goes on, and it says we will voluntarily respond to public records requests. So you could say, oh, well, if they're going to voluntarily respond, maybe she's still keeping her word. She's just putting this Lambert thing in because it's the law. But then you keep reading and it says, we'll evaluate your request based not just on the exemptions to the public records law, but the unique obligations of the governor's office, which is not something that's in the law. It's just something that they made up. And it's just another way of saying that we're not going to release stuff if we don't want to. And I should just be clear that like Maura Healey has gone out and said, well, I'm being more transparent because I've released my calendar with a massive amount of redactions to it. But past governors released stuff voluntarily too. So this is like basically she's playing a word game where she's saying, I've released my calendar, so I'm not claiming I'm totally exempt. But that like is, going back to what John was saying about like sort of lying, but trying to stay seeming, trying to have some plausible deniability. I mean, to me, this is just an outright lie because she knows better. But what she's trying to do is she's trying to basically put something out that's going to confuse someone who doesn't really understand this issue with any nuance. Because the idea of the public records law is if the public records law applies to you, you don't get to pick and choose when it applies to you. You only get to say, okay, there's a privacy exemption, there's a law enforcement investigation exemption, there's this exemption. I can claim those if they're relevant. But I can't just say, well, my office is unique, it's special. And if I don't want to give you some emails, which is something that I would normally have to give up, I can just say I don't have to. And it's not just her policy, just to be clear, like this is how she has approached actual records requests. Like I have asked for emails from the Baker administration and she said, oh, well, my policy only applies to the Healey administration, it's not retroactive. And that's not something where like Michelle Wu in Boston could say, I don't want to give up Marty Walsh's emails because I wasn't there at the time. She couldn't do that. And then, and you might say, okay, well, maybe it's reasonable just because, it wasn't the law at the time, but she's also rejected requests for her own emails with the same sort of blanket justification. Like the Boston Globe asked for emails with the leaders of the state legislature, who, remember, are also exempt. So you can't go to them and get these emails. You could only go to Maura Healey because she claimed that she was going to voluntarily follow this law. But then they rejected the Boston Globe's request too. And they just said that it would interfere with the governor's responsibilities, which is like ridiculous. And I mean, it'd be one thing, I guess, if they said, okay, we have the deliberative process exemption that I mentioned, and I don't want to release stuff that is part of an ongoing policy negotiation. But if you send me a request, once we've concluded all this business, maybe I'll see what I can release then. But that's not what they said. They just said, we've got this Lambert exemption. It interferes with my responsibilities. I'm just not going to do it. And so like, you just have to keep in mind, like when you're looking at state government, you get quotes from press releases or speeches or interviews on the radio, but the reporters don't have any ability to sort of dig in and examine what's really going on behind the scenes. So you're only getting half the picture, and you're getting the half that they want you to see. And you've got to wonder if there's a second half that they don't want us to see, like what's in there. Why won't they want us to see it? Because again, maybe it isn't always nefarious. Sometimes it isn't, but like if they don't want you to see it, there must be something juicy in there. Like what
I always think that
possibly be hiding.
It's also notable that like the straight like 2-second answer, yes, that's like WBUR where there's thousands of listeners and
Yeah,
people
right in the
will,
Boston
and that's what
Public
people will just
Library.
assume that like, okay, that's the answer. And then these press releases or whatever other things that come out that have all the gibberish and the whatever, things, and the actual requests, which you will never hear about, that get denied. Those things are super quiet.
Yeah, and like
Yeah,
another, sorry, I just want to give like one more example, which is that in another interview with Boston Public Radio, Healy had said specifically that she wasn't going to hide the ball on the MBTA. And then earlier this month, there was a story in Streets Blog Mass, which is like a transportation-focused news site. They had asked for this thing about the MBTA called the Capital Needs Assessment. And I'm sure everybody who listens to you guys or just lives in Massachusetts knows that the MBTA is like a horror show. And what this capital needs assessment was basically, it's just like a report that tallies up all the repair costs that they need from the MBTA. And the MBTA tried to charge them over $2,000. So they're like, okay, let's go to the Healy administration because they must have a copy. So they asked for, I think it was like emails that was mentioning this. And I assume they probably were hoping there'd be like an email attachment with a copy of the report or something. But they just, again, denied this request blanket. They did cite like attorney-client privilege and deliberative process and stuff, but they did say specifically that the unique obligations of the governor's office prevented them from releasing this material. So you go from like saying in public, I'm not going to hide the ball on the MBTA, to saying you can't even have this like factual report about how much it's costing, people just to repair it, and it, that I don't think that attorney-client privilege or deliberative process is a good explanation for that, because generally you're not supposed to hide like factual information. Like facts are not legal advice, and they're also not something covered by the deliberative process exemption. So it just doesn't make sense. It's just that seems that they don't want to release this information because they just don't want people to see it. And I mean, that's crazy.
Jordan.
Like just the cost of the MBTA is ridiculous.
Yeah, I think it's important to know for people that like, if you just to contrast this, we know a lot about like there's Donald Trump and January 6th and all the things that are in the news because there's a public records law that requires them to both catalog all the things the president does and make it public. And not just him, but all the president's past. All that information is available. And what we're saying is that same office that you see on the news, that we can know a lot about what it's done and what's doing. Our office, that executive branch, there's nothing. And not only that, we will never know. You can never know. You can't go retroactively backwards and get this information even after they leave office to find out how did they make decisions? Was there corruption? What were they doing? You can literally never know any of that information forever. And that's I think that's an extremist position that I think we need to make clear for people, that that's what she's claiming and that's what she's doing. And to your point, Anna, I think the reason that the governor is able to do this is that the media doesn't make that clear. It just copies and pastes the nonsense, as both sidesism to this. It gets their own interest. And I think they could make it clear that like this is just an outwardly bonkers position to be taking.
Yeah,
that like
I mean,
we would never allow this. If this was Trump, people would be in this, like they would just never be okay with this. But we just like quietly go along with just these nonsense answers.
And they could be clear. And they could also be clear saying, this is what she said, and this is what she did. Not just with the did. They could be clear about, she's told us yes, and here is what she's doing.
Yeah. I mean, I think that certain reporters have done a good job of bringing this issue up. Like the Globe did do a number of stories about this, but I think it's something that should come up often. That, I mean, I think part of the problem is like when all these records requests get rejected, people just stop making the request, and then it sort of stops being a news item to talk about it. And that's part of the problem is like, if you can make a request and it gets rejected, you're going to talk about that in your story. But then when they keep getting rejected, you just stop. You just stop it because it's not adding much to your reporting. But I think that it's still important context for people to understand that you're always only getting half the story when it comes to the governor.
But all the branches.
Yeah,
not just
all the
government.
branches. It's true.
I
The
mean, just
legislature-
the judiciary. Literally, the judiciary ruled that the governor was out of bounds, so that the judiciary's information about the own judges wouldn't get out. Like it's just its own fact. It's its own sort of self-fulfilling lack
Yeah.
of transparency. Sorry, Jonathan. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, just wanted to make a quick note about Jordan, your comments and before just reminded me of the value of such documents to history. That when somebody's writing about how and why events in the past happened, they need something, right? Like you're not gonna write a good story about any historical event if it's just based on news clippings from the time. Like they can be decent, but you're not getting the full picture of what happened, why decisions were made, to the best of your ability. And then so having that lack of that, I forget the formal term for that when you can like basically go back to retroactive records. That especially is a damaging thing, that they're not and to keep that going forward and going forward and going forward speaks to even like an inability to understand our state's history. A very quick side thing I just wanted to note, one of my favorite articles in The Onion is this one from November of 2005 that says CIA realizes it's been using black highlighters all these years. Joking about like with all of the redactions, it's like, oh, we thought we were drawing your attention to the important parts.
You know, that's funny. At one time, actually, I got a request back where they meant to redact something, but they had put like a red box around it, and I think it was supposed to be filled in with black after the fact, but they just left the red box around it. So it was like instead of blacking it out, they drew extra attention to what they didn't want me to see.
So good. Oh my gosh.
But yeah, I mean, I think we were going to talk about there's the governor, but then there's the legislature is probably, you know, the second biggest piece of state government that is exempt. And the legislature it's interesting because this is like the funnel through which all the reforms have to go through. You know, like the governor could voluntarily comply with the public records law, but to make sure future governors comply as well, you would have to get the legislature to pass a law. But then the legislature is also exempt, and obviously that's a choice of the legislature because they could at any time pass a law. And in fact, there have been for a number of years attempts to get this changed. And in fact, during the 2015 and 2016, they worked on this law that did in fact pass. It was like a big overhaul of the public records law. It was like the first big overhaul since the 1970s, and it made a lot of positive changes. There's certainly criticisms that could be made in terms of it not going far enough in a lot of ways, but it did generally improve the process a lot. But what they sort of did was they punted on this whole issue of should state government be, you know, well, not state government. I mean, just to be clear, like agencies like the MBTA or something, they are subject to the public records law. It's just the people at the very top, the governor, the legislature, the courts. But they sort of talked about this issue, should we all be subject to the law? And what they did is classic Massachusetts. They said, well, we're not sure, so we'll create a commission, which is basically the trick they do when they want to seem like they're doing something, but they just don't really want to do it.
Tell the story. I love this story. I think this is hilarious.
This is classic Massachusetts. So I mean, just to be clear, these commissions are made up of legislators. So these are the state lawmakers who you would have to get on board to pass the law. It's not like an independent group of, you know, like I don't know, like journalists or other interested parties who are going to come to some conclusion. It's the state lawmakers themselves. And so what they did is they didn't bother to meet for I think it was like a year or so. And
doing their jobs.
And it also was not until after the Boston Globe started asking them, hey, what's going on with this commission? So then the legislature gives the commission an 11-month extension on its deadline. And so finally, the commission disbands in 2019 without issuing a report. And there was sort of a split, I guess, from where the Senate was more enthusiastic about reform and the House just wasn't interested at all. And so while there was no like joint report, the senators on the committee, they released their own report, which it didn't say that they should be subject to the public records law, it basically proposed these really timid, modest reforms. Like the sort of two main ones were that legislative committee votes, these are the committees that before a bill goes up for a vote, it has to go through all these committees, and they will either give it a favorable rating or they'll kill it by sending it to study, which again is one of their little tricks of seeming like they're doing something without. I don't know what even are these studies? Do you guys know? I don't even understand this.
It's not real.
Yeah, I know. I don't think they're even a real thing. They're just
they don't exist.
yeah,
Then
they
the
just
public
do.
press to demand all the studies.
Yeah, so these committees, they vote in secret. Like you could have a theoretically, and maybe you guys know of actual examples of this. You could have someone saying, "Oh, I support this reform," but then they go in the committee where nobody knows what's happening, and they just kill the bill. And
all that happens all the time.
Yeah,
most bills fall into this category. People
they're co-sponsoring it. They co-sponsor the bill, and then
regularly co-sponsor a bill. And will think against it. One of my favorite examples is somebody was trying to move up and was publicly telling the LGBTQI community that they were supporting the transgender civil rights bill while secretly trying to kill it in committee.
Wow. Yeah. So
just quickly, one thing that's also even more damning about this is that I just remember that if folks remember that that there was a change. That what the House had proposed, and there was a lot of pressure for making committee votes public, and they were like, well, we'll publish the no votes. We're not telling you, and we'll tell you, like, we won't tell you how many, we won't give you everything, but we'll tell you who voted no, and we'll give you a tally. And one rep explained to me that part of the reason that they don't want to actually list everything out is because of how many of them don't even vote. Because if you only plan to give somebody an hour to vote, if you basically send out a poll at 2 p.m. and say votes in by 3, like if you're driving, you're not gonna suddenly like pull over to the side of your you might not even see that email because you like. And so because of how many of them don't even vote, and they didn't want to it would embarrass them to show how many people don't even vote. Yeah. It just reminds me of it's like, that's worse.
Yeah, so the Senate report, one of the reforms it was recommending was making these votes public, and then the second big reform that it mentioned was I'm sorry, what?
The committee votes.
No, the written, that was the first one. The second one is the written testimony that people submit, making that public. So when they hold all these hearings for bills in committee where they'll have people come in and testify in person, and actually they have started posting a lot of that online, which is great, like the video of it. But even if you have the video, still much quicker to be able to just read something than have to watch. Some of these hearings go on for like 5 hours, like they can get pretty exhausting. And they also jump around a lot, so it's like it's much easier to have things in writing. And on top of it, not everybody who testifies does testify in person. And we should be clear, like when we're talking about people testifying before these committees, it's not just like your neighbor down the street who cares about some issue. It could be, if it's a global warming type bill, it could be, like the fossil fuel industry or something, submitting testimony. And wouldn't it be nice to know what all these special interest groups are telling our state legislators? But we can't. But then again, this was in the Senate report. But the House in particular has been really effective at stopping any of these reforms from being implemented, not just from by blocking legislation, but also just by not changing the rules of the legislature. So they could sort of similar to how the governor can follow the public records law voluntarily, they could institute sort of their rules, but they won't even do that in the House. So it's a big problem in state government where we're missing all this stuff. And it makes it very difficult for people to participate, because like if you don't even know how your legislator is voting and who is sort of bending their arm, then how do you have any impact on the process? You could have a pleasant conversation with your state rep and they're like, oh, I'm in the committee, I'm going to vote for this. But if they're BSing you and you don't know that they're BSing you, like what are you supposed to do about that? There's nothing. You're out of luck.
Well, we are going to pause right here and mention that anybody who's listening to us, if you hear us pretty regularly, we would love to have your $5. That would be amazing. If you can just give us a small donation to the show, we know that everybody listening to this, and there's tons of people who see us on TikTok and other people who, whether it's YouTube or the podcast, social media, we put out tons of small quotes on social media so that our information is really getting out there, even for people who don't have time to listen to the full podcast. So we are reaching tons and tons of people, getting this information out there that you don't hear anywhere else except for on the Mass Dump newsletter and Lights Out Mass podcast. But all the different interviews that we do, we would love to hear from you. We also, on our website, we have a comments section. We would love to have your donation, large or small. And that, again, does not go to any of the ones that you see or hear on this show, but it goes to the folks who do the sort of grind back end work that keeps this podcast going. So we're gonna continue on. I would love to just ask you quick, Andrew, for how did you get started doing this?
So I guess my interest in this is from sort of the police and criminal justice angle. That has always been like my main focus. And I think I filed my first public records request around like 2011. And I don't, it's a very foggy memory. I think I heard about like the Freedom of Information Act, which is the federal law that, this is the similar law, but it applies to the federal government. And I just started kind of reading up on that and learning about the distinction between that and like the state laws. And just, I got very interested in how basically what we're talking about, how you can not take people at their word and you can actually go and like investigate things yourself. And that's sort of what got me into journalism as well. Just that idea that you don't, you can investigate things. It doesn't require. There's certainly a learning curve to it, but it's something that anyone can get involved with. It doesn't require you to be like a lawyer and have gone through law school or something just to like understand how this process works. And I think that it's like a really powerful thing that people should get involved with just if it interests them.
Yeah, and you have some links for us, right, that we'll be able to put in the show notes.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just say like, so I mean, we've been talking. Maybe this is gonna like be a downer for people and make them not want to get involved. We've been talking about how like the state is so opaque, but you can make public records requests to your city or town, and you can make them to state government. It's just you can do it to the governor. You're just probably not going to get anything, but you can go to agencies of the state government, like the state police or the MBTA or the like energy and environmental services, like whatever your interest is, you can make public records requests to them. And I'll share. I have just sort of like a basic intro how you can get involved in public records requests. And like I said, there is a learning curve. Like I've been doing this over 10 years and I accumulated a lot of knowledge, and I have learned how to like approach this, and I've learned a lot of the nuance of it, and you won't know that going in, and you might be intimidated by it, but it is, for all its faults, it is something that's open to the public, and it is something that like the average person can get involved with. It just takes a little bit of effort. You have to read up on it a little bit, but you can make public records requests, you can get information. And if you are denied, there's a whole appeals process, which I haven't written out my tips for that yet, but I can share a link to a podcast where I go into some of that people might find helpful. And there are like some tools out there people might want to be aware of. The main one I would point people to is, I just do all this in my email. I find that's the most convenient way to do it, but there's a website called Muckrock that they help facilitate public records requests, not just in Massachusetts, but all around the country, to different states and to the federal government. You can, I do think it costs a little bit of money, but you can sign up and they have like templates for every state, so you just fill in what you want and you don't have to worry about like filling in any of the other information. And they have accumulated like contact information for lots of people, so you don't have to look it up yourself. They're a very useful tool, especially if you're sort of new to this and you're not comfortable kind of like going out on a limb and doing it on your own. So check them out. A great site, and they are focused in Massachusetts. I believe their headquarters is still in Cambridge, so they're a local outfit. And I know it's been a while since I talked to any of them, but I do know some of the people. They're good people. But beyond that, I guess just another thing, if this whole transparency thing is of interest to you, but even if you don't want to get hands-on with it, you should be reaching out to your legislators and the governor and just telling them that this is an important issue. And there's 3 bills out there. I'll just focus on the one that I think is sort of the most expansive, which is by Senator Becca Rausch. Is it Rausch? I'm sorry if I got her name incorrect.
You got it right. Becca Rausch.
Rausch. Okay. She's got S-2064. It would apply the public records law to the governor and the legislature. And unlike the other bills out there, I believe it's actually retroactive too. I do have a concern about it, which is that it would add this exemption for like policymaking stuff that I think is more broad than the one that already exists. And I think that's probably a compromise, but I'm a little worried that if it ever became law, it would be a problem, because obviously the legislator and governor, their main thing is making policy. So I think it would exempt a lot of their records. But I think that we need to have something people can get on board with, and people should at least be reaching out to their legislators, to the governor, so S-2064, to talk to your legislators about that. Tell them that just transparency in general is like a very important thing. I've heard it before that like, oh, people don't care about that. They care about stuff that affects their bottom line. But, transparency, even if it's like sort of an abstract issue to some extent, it impacts everything. Like things don't change unless they're sort of out in the public sphere. They're out being debated by people. They're on the front page of the Boston Globe or whatever. And the only way to do that is to have the information available. So regardless of what your sort of pet issue is, transparency is related to it. And a lack of transparency is probably inhibiting, whatever reforms you think should be implemented, just because there's of the lack of debate it creates.
Yep. Can we ask you super quick, just a fun question about like what's kind of podcasting tools and other like your newsletter tools and stuff in 30 seconds?
Well, I do my newsletter through Substack. It's andrewqmr.substack.com. It might be easier to just search on Google for the Mass Dump if you can't remember that. But I don't know, in terms of podcasting, I've just been using Audacity and recording through Zoom and stuff. I don't have a particularly special setup for that yet. Maybe as I do it some more, I'll get something nicer, but it's been pretty simple so far. We just started the podcast. The one about Maura Healey was episode 3, but hopefully people will check that out. We went into a lot more detail about all the records requests that she's rejected, and we played all the clips of her talking about how she's going to be the most transparent governor ever, and trying to like explain away her lack of follow through on that. So I think people who like your podcast are probably going to find that entertaining and informative.
Fantastic. We hear that you have some ongoing lawsuits.
Oh yeah. So like I said, the main thing I'm focused on is like police in the justice system. So there's something called a Brady list people may have heard of. It's like a list of police officers. It's a list that's kept by prosecutors of police officers where there's some potential credibility issue. Like it may be that they were actually found to have been untruthful in the past. Sometimes it's like there was a finding of excessive force or something to that effect. And basically these prosecutors keep a list because when they prosecute someone, if they have evidence that could undercut their case in some way, they're required to turn that over to the defense. Like you can't just go in, and prosecute someone and hide all the evidence that's going to help their case. You've got to turn that stuff over. And that could include evidence that a witness is potentially not credible, or, you know, that their credibility could be undermined. And so not all prosecutors keep them, but there is something called a Brady list. Some of them do, like the Middlesex DA and some other DAs in the state. But regardless of whether they keep these lists, they're still required to make these disclosures. So I had been going around and requesting this stuff from all the DAs in Massachusetts. And I won't say these are the only two I had a problem with, but there are two that I most people listening to your podcast are probably going to have the ability to do, just because it's extremely time consuming. It's hard to find a lawyer. Like, my lawyer is representing me pro bono through a Harvard law clinic, you know, that they can only take on so many clients, and they can only do ones where they think it's going to be the most impactful and stuff. But I am suing the Bristol County District Attorney's Office and the Northwestern District Attorney's Office. The Northwestern DA, I mean, this cracks me up. Like, they gave me all these disclosures that they gave to defense lawyers, but they blacked out the names of all the police officers. So it's so ridiculous. And the funny thing is, like, some of this is stuff that I'm 99% sure has already been reported in the media. So it's like they're you know, making me go to court for something that it's already out there. Like, it's so ridiculous. In some cases, I don't think it's been reported, which is, you know, why I think it really is important to follow through. But, you know, it's ridiculous that they're claiming that it would, like, violate the police officer's privacy and that sort of thing. In the Bristol County case, it's a little more complicated. I don't think we can get into it. There's more legal issues, but it's sort of a similar thing where they're trying to hide a lot of the information about these Brady disclosures. And it's something I've written a bunch about on my newsletter, so you can go check that out. And I'm gonna have, like, an update about it soon. I don't know exactly when, but, you know, if you subscribe, you can read it when it comes out.
Yep. And you know, any feeling from my regular co-host before we ask for our final question about the importance of all this?
I just think it's just a reminder, just the importance of contacting your legislator about it. We already have guilted them into, like, the reason they started posting the video online is because of all of this, all of us complaining about it a bunch. The reason that they have agreed to the no vote is because we were pushing and complaining about it. Also because their position is undefensible and ridiculous and just fundamentally small d undemocratic. And I think so, you know, it's not, yes, it's opaque, but also we have been able to push this issue because their position is so out of whack, because we're such an outlier, because their positions are so extremist, in the absurd. And so continue to raise your voice about it, continue to push on it. And especially for police oversight, you know, that's the place where it's the most important, in my opinion, as well. Like, this is, you know, your ability to, your freedom, people's freedoms, people's children, people's jobs are all affected by the just us system. And so, you know, it requires regular people to provide oversight for there to be any sort of pressure for it to change in any way or be accountable in any way to the laws that they profess to believe in but constantly break on a regular basis. And fundamentally, Brady violations are simply the fact that the police break the law and lie, and they have to disclose that, and we allow that to happen. And I just think that should be clear for people, right? Like, every time on Law and Order, when one of the characters is, like, beating somebody or being, like, pushing the law, like, I don't really care, like, you should care, because you're breaking the law, and that would be disclosed. And, like, it's just like we don't need to be a society of, like, vigilante bullies.
Yeah, and just real quick, an example about that is when I got the Brady list from the Berkshire County DA's office, I found these disclosures about these two officers that talked about an excessive force investigation that was caught on video. And so I immediately, like, Googled it and was like, oh, there's no news reporting about this. So I started making more records requests. I got all this documentation. And I got the video. I did a whole lengthy article about this, and I found out that one of the police officers, he works in this tiny town out in Berkshire County called Egremont. I'm not even sure if I have the pronunciation correct, but he had gotten 11 complaints over the course of just a couple of years, 2 or 3 years that he was there, and he was also involved in this. There was a criminal investigation of this alleged excessive force incident. He was facing a lawsuit. So this guy, and he had also, on top of it, he had resigned from another job, and I was able to go and find out that there was a video of him kicking a guy in the groin and trying to get into a fist fight with him in a jail cell, and he had to resign from that job. And then he is just easily able to get a job with basically no background check. They didn't go and check these. They knew he had worked at this other police department, but they didn't go and pull his records and find out why he had left. And the only way I was able to find that out is because of public records, and make that information available. And that's the value of this, is that you can have a community like this where it's so small it doesn't even have a newspaper. But if these records are available, then someone who's making these records requests for these sort of broader issues, like a Brady list or something, is going to be able to find some of that stuff that's going to be overlooked, and then take a microscope to it and reveal it to the public.
Great. We are coming up on the end of our episode. How can people get engaged and involved?
So just again, I will give you guys that link to put up about sort of how to get started making public records requests, and I'll send you that bill as well. But I do think people should try making a public records request at least once or twice if you're interested in politics. It could be anything related to your town or city or whatever. It doesn't have to be some massive thing. It could just be you're curious about how much something costs, something like that, or you want to get some emails about some issue going on and find out what's going on behind the scenes. So really try it. It's called the public records law because it's for the public. It's not for journalists specifically or lawyers or whoever, activists. It's for anyone.
We will put that in the links below.
So try not to be intimidated, even if you get, I think I did write a little bit about this. Even if you get this letter full of intimidating looking legalese, and they're not going to give you any records, that doesn't mean that they're doing the right thing. And it doesn't mean that there's no way to approach it at that point. You can file an appeal, which again, I'll give you the information about that. And, just support transparency, tell people it's important, get involved in that way. And I think that's it. That's the bottom line.
And if I may, forward this podcast to your friends.
Yeah, of course. And if you guys want to send them some money, but also send me some money, you can sign up for a subscription to my newsletter. It's free, but you can also sign up for a paid subscription to help support all the work I'm doing. Because it's a lot, doing a podcast, I'm writing, I'm doing lawsuits, even though I'm being represented pro bono, it still eats up tons of my time, having to help plan out our legal strategy and all that kind of thing. So, I would like to believe that all the stuff I'm doing is making an impact. And if you agree with me, then definitely please help support me. That's another way you can get involved.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone. Great to be here with everyone listening and all of us chit-chatting. Thank you, Andrew, for all your work, and we'll see everyone next week. Hey there. Thanks so much for watching us on YouTube. Please like and subscribe. And it would be amazing if you would also subscribe to us on your favorite podcast player. Just look for Incorruptible Massachusetts wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks so much.